In March of 1883, a woman threw a party. It cost $250,000. That is approximately $8 million in today's terms, applied to a single evening. The invitations had gone to 1,200 of the most prominent people in New York society. The theme was a costume ball. Every guest required to appear in historical or fictional dress, which created, in the weeks before the event, the social performance of the richest devoting themselves to the question of what costume could demonstrate sufficient creativity and wealth to be worthy of attending. The woman giving the party was 30 years old. She was the wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore. She had been born Alva Smith in Mobile, Alabama, to a family that had money and then had lost it. Had spent her childhood in a household of reduced circumstances, and her adolescence in France and her 20s in a marriage that had placed her adjacent to one of the greatest fortunes in American history, without giving her the social position that the fortune should have provided. The Vanderbilts in 1883 were not received by Mrs Caroline Astor. Mrs Astor was the arbiter of New York society, the keeper of the 400, the list of the families whose position was sufficiently established to be acknowledged in her drawing room at 350 Fifth Avenue. The Vanderbilts were too new, too loud, too recently, and visibly rich. Cornelius the Commodore had been born on a farm on Staten Island and had made his fortune through methods that the old families of New York did not discuss in polite company. And the money he had generated had not yet aged into the respectability that old money required. Alva intended to change this. The house she had built at 660 Fifth Avenue, the Petit Chateau, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in a style of French Renaissance grandeur that was unlike anything else on the avenue, was the instrument. The costume ball was the mechanism. She had invited every person of significance in New York to the ball, and she had deliberately not sent an invitation to Caroline Astor's daughter, young Carrie Astor, whose friends had all received invitations and who came to her mother weeping about the exclusion. Caroline Astor descended from her brownstone. She had her cards brought to the Vanderbilt mansion. This act, in the act of leaving a calling card at a house previously unacknowledged, was, in the social grammar of the Gilded Age, the equivalent of formal recognition. It was surrender. It meant the Vanderbilts were received. Mrs. Astor arrived at the costume ball. Alva had won. Now here is the question this video is going to answer. The woman who threw this party, who built the house, and staged the ball and extracted the calling card from the most powerful social gatekeeper in America, is not the woman who is remembered. The woman who is remembered is the villain of her daughter's autobiography. The mother who locked Consuelo Vanderbilt in her room and told her she would marry the Duke of Marlborough, or Alva would break her will and her health in the process of compelling her. The mother who cried and said that distress was damaging her heart. The mother who forced a wedding at which Consuelo was photographed crying behind her veil. She is also the woman who, 20 years after that wedding, became one of the most militant voices of the American suffrage movement, who used her fortune and her social position to advance the cause of women's political equality with the same ferocious determination she had applied to every previous project. The question is how one woman can be all three things. How the woman who forced her daughter into a marriage she didn't want can become the woman who argued publicly for women's right to choose their own lives. What it costs to be someone whose ambition is large enough and whose methods are brutal enough that the people who love you become its casualties. What happens to the houses and the positions we build when the person who built them has moved on to something else. The Petit Chateau, the house she built to storm the gates of New York society, was demolished in 1926 to make room for an office tower. Alva, by then in her 70s and fully absorbed in the cause, noted the demolition in her memoirs in a single sentence and moved on. She had already moved on years before the wrecking ball arrived. Drop your city in the comments, and if these stories matter to you, then subscribe. Now let us go back to Mobile, Alabama in 1853, to the beginning of the person who would become Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. The battle between Alva Vanderbilt and Caroline Astor was not simply a social competition between two strong-willed women. It was a conflict between two different theories of what American society was supposed to be. Carolyn Webster Schermerhorn Astor Mrs. Astor, as she was always referred to, the definite article doing the work of indicating that there was only one Mrs. Astor worth naming, was the keeper of a tradition. Her tradition held that the quality of a family was determined by its duration in American society, by the accumulation of generations of respectable conduct and cultural refinement that converted money into something more than money. The families in her 400 were not simply rich. They were old enough to have forgotten how they had gotten rich, and this forgetting was the mark of their quality. The Vanderbilts remembered exactly how they had gotten rich. The Commodore had run a ferry boat. He had built railroads with a ferocity that his competitors had found violent, and his employees had found brutal, and that his family had found deeply inconvenient as a narrative when they were trying to be received at the Astor House on Fifth Avenue. The money was enormous, but it was visible money. Money that had marks on it, money that everyone could trace to a Staten Island farm and a borrowed $100 in 60 years of specific and documented accumulation. Caroline Astor's position depended on money not being traceable to specific sources. It depended on the fiction that quality was something separate from money, that the families she received had earned their position through something that could not be purchased. This fiction was useful to the families it protected and was maintained with considerable social force. Alva's position was that the fiction was false. She did not say this directly. She did not engage in ideological argument. She engaged in demonstration. She built the Petit Chateau in a style more impressive than anything on the avenue. She threw the costume ball at a cost that made the point she was making undeniable. She invited every person of social consequence in New York except Caroline Astor's daughter, which created the social pressure that made it impossible for Caroline Astor to maintain the exclusion. The calling card was an admission that money, after all, was money. That the Vanderbilt fortune, however recently made and however clearly traceable to specific acts of commercial aggression, was sufficient to earn the Vanderbilt family its place in the drawing rooms of New York. Caroline Astor yielded because she had to. The logic of the social world she had built required yields, required that power be acknowledged when it could not be denied. The Vanderbilt money could not be denied. The house could not be denied. The ball could not be denied. Mrs. Astor came to the ball in a Marie Antoinette costume. She was received by Alva with every courtesy. She was photographed in the ballroom. The photograph is in the record. The photograph is the measure of what Alva built the house for. She had it in 8 years. What she did with it next is the other half of the story. Alva Erskine Smith was born on January 17, 1853, in Mobile, Alabama, the daughter of Murray Forbes Smith and Phoebe Ann Disha. Her father was a cotton merchant, her mother from a distinguished Southern family, and her childhood was the childhood of a girl born into Southern gentility in the years immediately before that world was destroyed. The family had a townhouse in Mobile and a plantation outside the city, and the social position that came with both. Alva was the fourth of 5 children. She grew up in the assumption of prosperity. The Civil War ended that assumption. Murray Smith had invested in Confederate bonds and in the social and economic structures of the antebellum South, and when those structures collapsed, the Smith family wealth went with them. The family moved to New York, where Murray attempted to rebuild his commercial position with limited success. They lived in reduced circumstances, not poverty, but the humiliating condition of the formerly prosperous who must maintain appearances while the appearances become more expensive than the reality can support. Murray Smith took his family to France when Alva was a teenager, seeking in Europe the social environment where his daughter's prospects could be cultivated without the explicit reminder of their reduced circumstances. France was where American girls of genteel but modest means could acquire the languages and the manners and the social skills that the Gilded Age marriage market required, in a setting where the comparison with the American millionaires they needed to attract was less immediately bruising. Alva learned French. She learned to present herself. She developed in those years the qualities that would define her adult life. The ferocious social intelligence, the capacity for strategic thinking about the landscape of power and position, the willingness to make herself into whatever the situation required, and the fury of a woman who understood exactly what the game was and was determined to win it. She returned to New York in 1869. She was 16 years old. She had been educated for one purpose: to make a marriage that would restore the family's financial and social position. She met William Kissam Vanderbilt in the early 1870s. He was the son of William Henry Vanderbilt and the grandson of the Commodore. Positioned in the second generation of the dynasty that would eventually produce one of the largest private fortunes in American history, though in the early 1870s the full extent of that fortune had not yet been assembled. He was affable and not particularly driven. He liked horses and he liked society. He needed, as his family's position required, a wife who could manage the social dimensions of Vanderbilt life that he himself had neither the interest nor the talent for. Alva could manage them. They married on April 26, 1875. She was 22 years old. He was 25. She entered the Vanderbilt world with the determination of someone who had been preparing for it for 20 years and who understood, with the clarity of the upwardly mobile who have watched the mechanisms of social power from the outside, exactly what was required to convert money into position. The Petit Chateau was Alva's primary instrument. She had conceived it, designed it in partnership with Richard Morris Hunt, managed its construction, and understood precisely what it was for. It was not simply a house. In the social logic of Gilded Age New York, a house was a statement, a material claim on a position in the hierarchy of the visible. The size and style and cost of your house told the world exactly what you thought you were, and the world assessed whether you were right. The brownstones that lined Fifth Avenue in the 1870s were the houses of the established families, the old New York that had been building on the avenue since the city moved uptown. They were large and well-appointed, and they communicated through the restraint of their presentation, the confidence of people who did not need to announce themselves because their position was assumed. Alva did not have that confidence because she did not have that position. She was a Vanderbilt wife, adjacent to enormous wealth, but the wealth had not yet produced the social acceptance that the Astors and the Belmonts and the Leidigs and the others maintained. She needed to make a claim on that acceptance, and she needed the claim to be so large and so visible and so artistically accomplished that dismissing it would require an act of will that even Caroline Astor would eventually find too costly. She specified the style, French Renaissance Chateauesque, the style of the Loire Valley Chateau, Sprudelnent translated into limestone and brought to the corner of 52nd Street and Fifth Avenue. The building that resulted was 60 feet wide and 5 stories high, with turrets and dormers and carved stone ornament, and a staircase hall of alabaster and Caen stone. The architect who built it had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and had worked on the Louvre. The house that resulted was the most architecturally ambitious private residence on the avenue. It opened in 1882. The costume ball of March 1883 was the public announcement of its completion and the commencement of its social purpose. $250,000 spent in one evening. Mrs. Astor's calling card delivered. The Vanderbilts received. The campaign had taken 8 years from the marriage to the acknowledged position. Alva had run it with the strategic intelligence of a general who had spent her life understanding the terrain. She had won the first battle. The Newport summer was the stage on which Gilded Age wealth performed itself for the largest audience available. The resort had been a summer retreat for prosperous families since the early 19th century, and by the 1880s it had become the primary theater of the American plutocracy. The place where the fortunes that had been made during the year were displayed in the houses and the parties and the four-in-hand drives and the yacht races and the formal dinners that structured the social calendar from late June to early September. The cottages were the primary instruments of display. They were not cottages in any descriptive sense. They were palaces, built at costs that made the word mansion insufficient, on bluffs above the Atlantic with gardens that required armies of groundskeepers and interiors that required annual refurnishing from the workshops of Europe. Each new cottage was supposed to exceed the previous one, which produced across the 1880s and 1890s an escalation of architectural ambition and expenditure that culminated in a group of buildings that have no precedent in American residential construction. Marble House was Alva's contribution to this escalation. She had conceived it as the definitive statement, the house that would close the argument about whether the Vanderbilts belonged at Newport by making the argument unanswerable. $11 million. White sienna marble on the facade, yellow sienna marble in the entrance hall, pink marble in the dining room, oak paneling in the Gothic room where Alva eventually held suffrage meetings after Oliver's death. The gold room, the ballroom on the piano nobile, lined entirely in gilded bronze and hung with chandeliers that cost more individually than most American families spent in a lifetime. She gave the house to herself as a birthday present in August of 1892, a party for herself at her own house, to which she invited everyone who mattered at Newport, and at which she appeared as the hostess of the most magnificent house in America. She was 40 years old. She had been working toward this for 20 years. The dinner parties at Marble House were events in themselves, not simply meals, but performances organized around the display of the house, and the hospitality, and the social intelligence of the hostess. Alva managed them with the same thoroughness she applied to everything, knowing which guests would animate each other, and which required careful placement, and what the conversation should accomplish, and what impressions should be produced. She was, at her peak, perhaps the most accomplished social operator of her generation in America. The combination of intelligence and ferocity and strategic capacity that had organized her life was applied to the dinner party, with the same seriousness she had applied to the architectural program of the Petit Chateau and the campaign against Mrs Astor. She could talk about art and music and politics and the social movements of Europe and the financial news from Wall Street, and she could do all of this while managing the room's temperature and dynamics and the service of 12 courses with the simultaneous attention of a general and a conductor. The building she had built for this is now the most visited house museum in Newport. 1 million people a year walk through the gold room. The rooms are preserved, the gilding is maintained, the marble is maintained. The house outlasted the social world it was built to conquer. Alva's ghost is in the house in a way it is not in the records of the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. The rooms she specified are still exactly the rooms she specified. The rooms she conquered are gone. William Kissam Vanderbilt was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, an essentially decent man who had the misfortune to be married to Alva. This is not entirely fair to him. He had his own failings, the mistress being the most documented. But the essential picture that emerges from the historical record is of a man who was pleasant where his wife was ferocious, easy where she was driven, content where she was restless, and who spent 20 years as the financial engine of campaigns whose ambition far exceeded his own. He had been born in 1849, the second son of William Henry Vanderbilt, in the position of the Vanderbilt family's second generation. Enormously wealthy by inheritance, famous by name, burdened by the expectations that attach to the sons of rich men who have not themselves created the wealth they inhabit. His father had doubled the Commodore's fortune through conscientious management. William Kissam's challenge was to inhabit the dynasty without the drive that had built it. He loved horses. He was one of the most accomplished amateur horsemen of his generation. He drove coaches, he raced yachts, he maintained stables that produced horses competitive at the highest levels of the sport. He was generous, he was sociable. He did not have his wife's appetite for the mechanics of social warfare, and this absence organized their dynamic. She fought, he financed, and the arrangement worked as long as both parties found it acceptable. He found it acceptable until he didn't. The mistress, Mrs. Neustretter, the widow with whom he maintained the relationship that Alva eventually used as grounds for the divorce, was not concealed with any particular care, which suggests either that William Kissam had ceased to consider Alva's feelings on the matter, or that he had concluded she would not act. He knew his wife well enough in most respects. He had perhaps underestimated this one. When the divorce came, he was genuinely shocked, not by the fact of the divorce, but by the speed and thoroughness with which Alva executed it. He had not expected the legal action to move as quickly as it did. He had not expected the settlement she demanded, which was substantial. The Fifth Avenue house, the Newport properties, a financial settlement that reflected what 2 decades of social infrastructure had been worth. She had organized the campaign with the same efficiency she applied to the costume balls. He paid the settlement and agreed to the terms. He was, in this as in most things, not a man who fought when fighting was costly. He remarried in 1903, Anne Harriman, a widow of good family who had been married twice before. She managed the Petit Chateau after Alva's departure and the household that Alva had built, and she did it without Alva's theatrical ambition, but with sufficient competence. William Kissam died in Paris in 1920 at 70 years old, having spent his final years partly in France and partly in Newport, having done little of consequence after the divorce that had freed him from the most consequential relationship of his life. His estate was sold. The Petit Chateau was part of the estate. The real estate developer acquired it, and the wrecking ball arrived. He was 5 years dead when his most famous house came down. The divorce was filed in 1895. It was one of the most shocking social events of the decade, more shocking than the architecture of the Petit Chateau, more shocking than the conquest of Mrs Astor, more shocking than the elevation of the Vanderbilt name from new money into acknowledged dynasty. In the world that Caroline Astor had defined and that Alva had spent 20 years penetrating, divorce was not done. It was not done because it was incompatible with the social fiction that the world required its women to maintain. The fiction that everything was fine, that the arrangements were acceptable, that the visible surface of family life corresponded to something real. Alva knew the fiction was incompatible with her dignity, and she was not willing to maintain it. She also had a reason beyond dignity. She had been conducting her own arrangement. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was the son of August Belmont, the American representative of the Rothschild interests and one of the most prominent financiers in the country. Oliver was 40 years old, a man of leisure and considerable means, who had been part of the social world that Alva had occupied for 2 decades. He wanted to marry her. She wanted to marry him. The divorce was Alva's choice, made for Alva's reasons, pursued through the mechanisms of a legal system that she had the resources to deploy and that she deployed without hesitation. The consequences were immediate and severe. Society closed around her. The invitations stopped. The calls stopped. The specific machinery of social exclusion, the mechanism that she had cracked by building the Petit Chateau and throwing the costume ball, was turned on her with the same efficiency she had used to crack it. She responded the way she always responded to opposition, by converting it into a campaign. The campaign was Consuelo's marriage. Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived at Blenheim Palace in November of 1895 as the 9th Duchess of Marlborough, with a settlement of $2,500,000, providing the income that the palace required to function, and the marriage providing the title that Alva had decided her daughter needed. Blenheim Palace is one of the largest private houses in England, a Baroque monument built by the Duke of Marlborough of the early 18th century, the John Churchill who had defeated the French at the Battle of Blenheim, and who had been rewarded by a grateful Queen Anne with the palace and the land, and the title that his descendant was now converting into cash by marrying Consuelo Vanderbilt. The palace is enormous, cold, impossible to heat adequately, impossible to maintain without an income that the Marlborough estate in 1895 could not generate on its own. The 9th Duke was not a warm man. He was, by most accounts, including Consuelo's own, a man of intelligence and some genuine qualities. He was a capable estate manager and a conscientious member of the House of Lords, and he had aesthetic sensibilities that Consuelo eventually came to respect. He was not capable of giving her what she had wanted when she married Winthrop Rutherford, which was to be loved. He was not built for love in the demonstrative sense that the word requires. He was built for duty and for the maintenance of the position he had inherited, and he performed these functions with the English aristocratic combination of conscientiousness and emotional unavailability that Consuelo found, across 11 years of marriage, entirely insufficient. They had 2 sons. John, who became the 10th Duke, was born in 1897. Ivor was born in 1898. The production of the heir and the spare completed the most essential obligation of the marriage, and from that point forward, the couple's relationship deteriorated with the slow inevitability of a marriage that had never been grounded in mutual feeling. Consuelo found other things to ground herself. She was not her mother's daughter in everything. She did not have Alva's ferocity or her appetite for social domination. But she had her mother's intelligence and a version of her mother's determination that expressed itself in philanthropy, rather than in social climbing. She worked with the women of the Woodstock district, the agricultural workers and their families who lived in the area around Blenheim, providing assistance and organizing social services with the administrative ability she had inherited from Alva. She became a public figure in England on her own terms, not as the Duchess who was known for the brilliance of her entertainments, though she gave those too, but as a woman who had identified a role for herself outside the purely decorative function that the marriage had been designed to produce. She was unhappy inside it, by every account. She wrote to her mother about this. The letters have not been fully published, but their content is clear from the accounts of the correspondence. A young woman asking for acknowledgement of what had been done to her and what it was costing her. Alva's responses were, for most of that decade, unsatisfactory. The responses of a woman who had made a calculation and was not prepared to revisit the calculation simply because the person most affected by it was suffering. The calculation had produced Alva's social rehabilitation. The suffering was Consuelo's problem. This is the hardest thing to look at in Alva's story, not that she was capable of the forced marriage, which is explicable within the logic of the social world she had inhabited and the necessity she was operating under, but that she was capable of watching the consequences of the forced marriage for a decade and not allowing them to alter her assessment of what she had done. She was capable of this because she was also capable of the work that followed. The capacity to hold a position in the face of evidence against it is the capacity that produces both the worst of Alva and the best of her. The same ferocity of conviction that locked Consuelo in a room was the ferocity that marched for the vote. She could not have been one without being the other. This does not excuse the locked room. It explains why the door opened eventually. Stasto. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 17 years old in 1895, beautiful and accomplished, and in love with a man named Winthrop Rutherford. Winthrop Rutherford was an American of excellent family, handsome, socially connected, the kind of man that Consuelo would have been encouraged to marry in the normal operation of the Gilded Age marriage market. He was not, by any objective assessment, an unsuitable match for the daughter of the Vanderbilts. He was unsuitable only to Alva. Alva had been watching the transatlantic marriage market with the strategic attention she applied to every social landscape, and she had understood what Consuelo Iznaga had demonstrated in 1876 and what a generation of American heiresses had confirmed in the intervening years, that an English dukedom purchased with an American fortune converted money into title in the specific exchange that allowed the American social hierarchy to be leapfrogged entirely. Consuelo would not simply be a Vanderbilt wife. She would be a duchess. Her social position would be guaranteed by the constitution of the British aristocracy, rather than by the goodwill of Caroline Astor, and the mother of a duchess would be immune to social exclusion. The divorce could not touch the mother of a duchess. Whatever Alva had done, whatever the gossip said, whatever the invitations failed to arrive, none of it mattered if her daughter was the Duchess of Marlborough, and the title put Alva beyond the reach of New York's judgment. The 9th Duke of Marlborough visited Newport in the summer of 1895. He was 23 years old, the holder of one of the most ancient and distinguished titles in England, and the master of Blenheim Palace, the vast Baroque palace in Oxfordshire that was among the greatest private houses in Britain, and that required, for its maintenance, an income that the family no longer possessed in sufficient quantity. He needed money. Alva had money. The negotiation that followed was the negotiation that the transatlantic marriage market existed to facilitate. The details were managed by Alva and by the Duke's advisors. The settlement was $2,500,000 in Beech Creek Railway stock, producing an annual income of $100,000, guaranteed to the Duke regardless of what happened to the marriage. Consuelo was not present at this negotiation. She was in her room. The accounts of what happened in that room, the accounts that Consuelo herself gave, first privately and then, decades later, in her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, describe a mother who arrived at her daughter's room and used every instrument available to her to produce the compliance she required. She told Consuelo she would break her will if she did not comply. She told her that her love for Rutherford was endangering Alva's health, that the emotional distress was damaging her heart. She cried. She threatened. she informed Consuelo that she had written to Rutherford to break the engagement, an act she had performed without Consuelo's knowledge or consent. Consuelo complied. She later wrote, "I was to be sacrificed on the altar of her ambition." The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue. 3,000 people were in the pews. The street outside was packed. The occasion was covered by the press of 2 countries as the social event of the decade. In every photograph from the wedding, Consuelo's face is averted. In the descriptions that survive, she was crying behind her veil for the duration of the ceremony. Alva was photographed looking satisfied. Oliver Hazard. Perry Belmont was 36 years old when Alva married him in November of 1895, a few weeks after Consuelo's wedding to the Duke of Marlborough. He was the son of August Belmont, the American representative of the Rothschild interests, the man who had financed the Democratic Party for 3 decades and who had built one of the great fortunes of the Gilded Age through the particular combination of European banking connections and American political relationships that made him uniquely positioned in the financial world of the mid-19th century. Oliver had inherited considerable money and no particular vocation, which is a condition that the 19th century managed reasonably well by providing wealthy men of leisure with horses and clubs and yachts, and the social calendar that made the absence of a vocation invisible. He loved architecture. He had built Belcourt Castle at Newport in 1894 before his marriage to Alva, had commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had built the Petit Chateau and Marble House, to design a summer home that reflected his particular enthusiasms: the Gothic ballroom with its stained glass and its carved stone, the ground floor stables that brought the horses inside, the rooms that were organized around his collections of medieval armor and European antiques. He was a man with genuine aesthetic sensibility and the money to pursue it. He was also, by the accounts of people who observed them, genuinely fond of Alva. This was the quality that distinguished him from William Kissam. Not that Oliver was a better man in any abstract sense, but that he was a better match. He found Alva's ferocity entertaining rather than exhausting. He shared her social world without requiring it to be organized around his own advancement. He let her be who she was and found the spectacle interesting. She was happy in the marriage, not the performing contentment happy of the Vanderbilt years, but the actual happiness of a woman who has found a partner rather than a financier. She traveled with Oliver. She built Belcourt further with him. She became, in these years, the version of herself that the previous years had been working toward, a woman in possession of what she had pursued, able to enjoy it without the constant awareness that the position could be lost. She was also aware, watching the movement develop in these years, that something larger than her own social position was being contested. The women who were arguing for the vote were arguing for the structural change that would have made her own 20s less brutally transactional, would have meant that a woman born to a family of reduced circumstances in Alabama in 1853 had options beyond a strategic marriage for rebuilding her position. She was not yet involved. She was watching. Oliver died in June of 1908. He had been ill for several years with an abdominal condition that the medical treatments of the era could not resolve. He was 49 years old. Alva was 55. She spent the year after his death in the position of a widow whose social world had been organized around the partnership that was now gone, a position she found intolerable within whatever tolerance grief permits. By 1909, she was at the meetings. By 1910, she was funding them. By 1912, she was one of the most prominent advocates in the country. Oliver Belmont had, by dying, freed her to become the last and largest version of herself. She would not have chosen this. She had been happy, but Alva Smith had been converting loss into purpose since she was a teenager in a French pension, learning to present herself for a marriage market, and she converted this loss with the same efficiency. The suffrage cause was the last campaign. It was also the first one she had fought for something beyond herself. What happened next was the most unexpected transformation of the Gilded Age. The suffrage movement that Alva joined after Oliver Belmont's death in 1908 was not the polite petition gathering that the women's movement had been in its earlier decades. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, which was the older and more moderate wing of the movement, had been working through legislative channels for decades with limited success. The states had been persuaded one by one. Wyoming in 1869, Colorado in 1893, Idaho and Utah in 1896, but the federal amendment that would give all American women the vote had not moved through Congress, and the pace of state-by-state progress was too slow for the generation of activists who had been working towards suffrage since before the Civil War. Alva found the more radical wing more congenial. Alice Paul had returned from England in 1910, where she had been active with the Pankhurst suffragettes, the British women who had moved from petition to direct action, who had chained themselves to railings and broken windows and gone on hunger strikes in prison. She founded the Congressional Union for Woman Suffrage in 1913, which eventually became the National Woman's Party. Her strategy was to hold the party in power responsible for the failure to pass a suffrage amendment, to campaign against Democrats regardless of their personal positions on suffrage, because the Democratic Party controlled Congress and had failed to act. This was controversial within the suffrage movement, where the more moderate wing believed that voting against friendly Democrats would create enemies without creating allies. Alice Paul believed that the moderate approach had been tried for decades with insufficient results, and that the direct confrontation strategy was the only one likely to produce the federal amendment. Alva agreed with Alice Paul. She contributed money to the National Woman's Party on a scale that reshaped what the organization could do. She contributed her Newport home. She had converted Marble House into a center for suffrage meetings in her Newport years, opening the spaces that had hosted Gilded Age costume parties to the meetings of women organizing for the vote. She contributed her social network, which was the network of the American plutocracy, and she used it to bring the cause to people who would not otherwise have encountered it. She also contributed herself, the public presence of a woman who had been one of the most prominent figures in American society for 2 decades, who brought to it the social legitimacy that the cause needed to penetrate the drawing rooms of the wealthy. The suffragists who picketed the White House beginning in January 1917, who stood in front of the White House with signs calling Woodrow Wilson Kaiser Wilson and pointing out the contradiction between fighting for democracy in Europe while denying it to American women at home, were women who were willing to be arrested. They were arrested. They were taken to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia, where they were subjected to conditions that were eventually publicized as the Night of Terror. The evening when the prison guards, under the orders of the workhouse superintendent, beat and bruised the women in their cells, twisted their arms behind their backs, slammed them against walls and iron bed frames. The publication of what had happened at Occoquan produced the public outrage that advanced the cause more than any legislative strategy had managed. Alva funded the legal efforts that followed and the publicity that made the Night of Terror part of the national conversation. The 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920. Alva was 67 years old. She had been fighting for the vote for 12 years. She sent Alice Paul a check. She had paid for a lot of things in her life. This was the payment she was most proud of. The years between the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 and Alva's death in 1933 were years of consolidation and complication. The vote had been won. The women who had fought for it were now navigating the question of what to do with it, how to convert the political right into political power, how to organize the constituencies that had different interests and different priorities, how to maintain the movement's energy now that the galvanizing single goal had been achieved. Alva continued in the National Woman's Party, which had moved on from that battle to advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, the proposed constitutional amendment that Alice Paul had drafted, which would have prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex. The ERA was not ratified in Alva's lifetime. It is still not ratified. She was in her 70s for most of this period, and the body that had been driven at relentless pace for 6 decades was registering the pace. She spent part of each year in France, where Consuelo and Jacques Balsan lived, and the relationship with Consuelo in these final years was the most direct evidence that the worst of what had happened between them had been addressed without being erased. They were not the same women they had been in 1895. Consuelo had lived 11 years in a marriage she had not chosen and had come through it with the philanthropic commitments and the public work that had given her life its shape. She had married Jacques Balsan in 1921 and was happy in the second marriage in the way that her mother had been happy in the second marriage. She had found the life that the first marriage had prevented. Alva had testified to free her from the first marriage. The testimony had been costly. It had confirmed publicly what the world had suspected, and it had required Alva to stand in a formal proceeding and state, in terms the record would preserve, that her daughter had been compelled. The compulsion was part of the record now. Alva had put it there. The relationship that emerged from this acknowledgement was not the relationship of a daughter who had forgiven and a mother who was forgiven. It was the relationship of two women who had survived each other and who found, in their 70s and 80s, that survival was the ground on which something real could be built. They worked together on the Equal Rights Amendment. They traveled together. They corresponded. They were photographed together in France in the late 1920s, two women of considerable age and considerable experience, one of whom had imposed her will on the world for 70 years, and one of whom had navigated the imposition of that will for 50 years, both of them finding in the end that the navigation had been the making of them. Alva died on January 26, 1933, in Paris. She was 79 years old. Consuelo was with her. The suffragists who knew of her death arranged for a memorial service at which Alice Paul spoke. Paul spoke of Alva's contribution to the cause, the money, the house in Newport open to the meetings, the congressional testimony, the sheer presence of a woman who made the cause impossible to dismiss as the project of marginal people. This is accurate as far as it goes. Alva was not marginal. She had been, for 50 years, one of the most visible women in America. She had made the cause visible to audiences it could not otherwise reach. The memorial service in Newport was held at Marble House. The Gold Room, where Alva had hosted the dinners of the Gilded Age, held the women who had fought for the vote. It was the most apt final image available. She had built the room for one purpose and lived to use it for another. Both purposes were fully Alva. Neither one alone was the whole of her. The relationship with Consuelo, which had been severed by what Alva had done and the subsequent years of Consuelo's unhappy life at Blenheim, was repaired slowly and then more substantially by the one act that Alva performed for her daughter that was not calculated for any purpose beyond Consuelo's benefit. The marriage to the Duke of Marlborough had been formally separated in 1906. The formal divorce would come later, and with it the question of what the Vatican would say, whether it could be annulled, freeing Consuelo to remarry in the Catholic Church. This question mattered because Consuelo wished to marry again, and the man she wished to marry was Jacques Balsan, a French aviator of means and charm. The Vatican's annulment process required testimony from the parties about the circumstances of the original marriage. Alva testified. She testified that she had forced the marriage. She stated, in the formal proceedings that would determine whether the marriage was considered valid by the Church, that Consuelo had been compelled, that the act of marrying the Duke of Marlborough had not been a free act of Consuelo's will, and therefore had not been the sacramental union that Catholic marriage required. This testimony was devastating to her own reputation. It confirmed publicly what had been rumored and whispered and partially known, that the Marlborough marriage, one of the defining social events of the Gilded Age, had been a coercion. That the bride crying behind her veil had been crying for the specific reason that she had not wanted to be there and had not been given a choice. Alva gave this testimony knowing what it would confirm about her. She gave it because Consuelo needed it. She gave it because it was true. And she gave it, perhaps, because it was the one act that could begin to address the debt that no amount of suffrage work or political activism or donated money could fully pay. The annulment was granted in 1926. Consuelo married Jacques Balsan. She was happy. She described her second marriage as the one she had chosen. The Petit Chateau was demolished the same year. The wrecking crews arrived at 660 Fifth Avenue in 1926. Alva was 73 years old. It had been sold long ago. After William Kissam's death in 1920, his estate had sold the property to a banking trust, which had sold it to Benjamin Winter, a real estate developer who had calculated correctly that the site at 660 Fifth Avenue was worth far more as an office tower than as a private residence, however magnificent the residence might be. The demolition was not dramatic. It came down the way expensive things come down when they have been outcompeted by time and economics, methodically with workmen and equipment over a period of weeks. The limestone walls and the turrets and the alabaster staircase hall, and the salon designed in Paris by Jules Allard, and the Marie Antoinette desk from Chateau de Saint-Cloud that had been in the Louis XV salon. All of it made way for the building that rose in its place, the commercial tower at 666 Fifth Avenue that told the story of New York real estate in the early 20th century. In her draft memoirs, Alva noted the demolition in a sentence. She had already moved on. She had moved on when she moved into Marble House in 1892, and then when she moved into Belcourt, and then when Oliver died and the movement claimed her. She had built the Petit Chateau for a purpose, and the purpose had been achieved. The calling card received, the ball attended, the position established, and she was a woman who moved on from achieved purposes. The building was never the point. The victory the building was supposed to produce was the point. The victory had been won before the mortar was dry. She could not say the same about every victory. The victory of Consuelo's marriage had been won on November 6, 1895, in the Church of St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue. It had cost Consuelo 11 years of unhappiness at Blenheim, 2 sons she loved but a husband she could not love, and the loss of the man she had wanted before her mother had intervened. It had cost Alva, eventually, her own credibility. The testimony she gave at the annulment proceedings confirmed in detail what the world had suspected, and the detail was not comfortable for a woman who had positioned herself as an advocate for women's freedom. The victory of the suffrage movement had been achieved in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified and American women received the vote. Alva had been working toward this for 12 years. The achievement was real and consequential, and she had contributed to it materially and publicly. These two things coexisted in the same life: the mother who locked her daughter in a room and the woman who gave testimony to free her daughter from the marriage she had forced. The builder of the house that said the Vanderbilts had arrived, and the suffragist who argued that the world the house represented should be dismantled. The woman whose methods were brutal and whose purposes were, in the end, larger than the methods. Alva Smith Vanderbilt Belmont died on January 26, 1933 in Paris. She was 79 years old. She had spent the final years of her life partly in France, where Consuelo and Jacques Balsan lived, and partly in America, where the cause had given way to the New Deal and the next set of political battles, and the energy of a country changing at a rate that even Alva's capacities could not fully match. The death was covered in the newspapers with the attention that her life had earned. She was described as one of the most significant women of the Gilded Age, a description that was accurate in its identification of her significance and incomplete in its account of what that significance had cost. She had been the architect of her own world. She had drawn the plans and specified the materials and managed the construction with a thoroughness that exceeded anything the actual architects who worked with her could provide. The Petit Chateau, Marble House, Belcourt, the suffrage campaigns, the congressional testimony, the Vatican testimony, all of it built by the same woman, all of it carrying the marks of the same intelligence and the same determination and the same willingness to run over whatever was in the way. Consuelo was with her when she died. The relationship had been repaired, not fully, not without the permanent residue of the forced marriage and the locked room and the crying bride, but repaired enough that the daughter was there at the end, and that the end was not attended by the estrangement the middle years had made possible. They had found their way to each other across the debris of what Alva had done and what it had cost. The Petit Chateau had been demolished 7 years before Alva died. The office tower at 666 Fifth Avenue occupied the block. The costume ball that had cracked the gates of New York society had been 43 years earlier. The calling card from Mrs. Astor, the measure of the victory, had been delivered before Consuelo was born. Alva had outlived the house and the marriage and the social world she had built and the social world she had tried to change. She had outlived most of the things she had tried to do. What she had not outlived was herself. The secrets the Petit Chateau was demolished to bury were not secrets at all in the end. They were the record of a woman who had done what she had done in full view of the society she was performing for, and who had been seen doing it, and who had eventually testified in detail about the worst of it, and who had gone on living and working and building for another 30 years after the testimony, because stopping was not something Alva Smith Vanderbilt Belmont was constitutionally capable of. The house is gone. The record is not. She chose to make sure of that herself. That is the story of Alva Vanderbilt and the Petit Chateau that was demolished to bury her secrets. The secrets were never buried. She left them in the record on purpose. That was the last campaign. That was the hardest one. That was the one she won.